very serious. Go for it, Moz. Getting zoomed in on. Sure what's happening.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us for this evening's discussion. A little bit of housekeeping to start with. We're not expecting any fire drills, so if the fire alarm goes off, if you follow the green signs, it will just be back out the same way as you came in. People who joined us remotely, can you give me a thumbs up reaction if you can hear us? Great news. Okay, good. Yeah, so thank you for coming. Thank you to those people who submitted questions in advance. We have quite a long list of questions, but if we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll maybe be able to take some more if anyone's got them. People that join remotely, if you want to pop questions in the Q&A box, then feel free. We will do our best to squeeze them in at the end. I'm going to hand over to our panel now to introduce themselves and kick off the discussion.
So welcome everyone, thanks for coming, and thanks to people online. My name's Tom Oliver, I'm a partner here at Powell Gilbert, and we are joined today by three people from Powell Gilbert. We've got James Burgess, who's an associate here, Jess Rosethorn, and Pete Damarat, who's a partner. And then we've got Alice Hart from 3 New Square and Mike Conway from 8 New Square. So we've got three solicitors and 2 barristers, all of whom specialise in IP. So we've got, as Anna said, lots of questions have been submitted, but equally, if you've got any questions in the room, we've got a relatively small group in here, so please just stick a hand up if you've got any questions you want answered that we haven't covered. And what I guess the aim of today is really to give you a bit of background as to how to get into a career in IP law, what it's really like, what the different routes are. There's quite a, it sounds very simple, but there's quite a lot of different roles within IP law as well that you should consider if you're interested in it. And also talk a bit about routes to qualification, typical day-to-day work, and also have a think about work-life balance, because law is generally not perceived to be particularly friendly in that regard, but hopefully we'll have some more comforting words on this panel. So I think we'd start with kind of routes to qualification, really thinking about what you might need to do if you are heading down this route. So I think we thought we'd start with Alice, just to ask to answer what are the routes to being a barrister, and I suppose particularly we're thinking about the IP bar, but what are the routes to qualifying?
Yes, so the starting point is either a law degree or any degree you like with a law conversion. So that's a 1-year course which you can do off the back of any degree you like. So we have people that have done English degrees, history degrees, biochemistry degrees, chemistry degrees, whatever it is. So that's the starting point. After that, I think that's common to solicitors as well. And after that, I suppose you need to make the decision either one way or the other. So we have 1 more year of what's I think now called the BVC. It used to be called the BPTC, but for present purposes, I'll just call it the bar course, which you can do through various institutions. There are a few in London that do it, and now I think the Inns of Court, which I'll explain in a second, have clubbed together, and there's now something called the Inns of Court School of Law, which is now running its own bar training course as well. And having completed that, you would then need to, and you usually would have applied in advance to a set of chambers to do 1 year in training, sort of shadowing various members of chambers, a year called pupillage. And it depends, I think, on the chambers how exactly that's structured, but it's roughly 2 or 3 months with varying levels of junior barristers, and you get to shadow them and pick up all the tricks of the trade that way. And towards the end of that year, chambers will meet and decide whether they want to keep you. And if they keep you, you become a tenant in chambers. And from that point on, you are self-employed, sort of on your own, but still very much attached to and part of your chambers. So Mike and I are at different chambers, albeit 5 doors down from each other. So number 3 New Square and number 8 New Square. And there are a couple of other IP specific chambers as well. 11 South Square's one, Hogarth Chambers, and various other ones. So that's, oh, I said I'd explain the Inns of Court because that is quite a strange feature of the bar. So to be a qualified barrister in any practice area, you have to be a member of an Inn of Court. There are 4, they're called Lincoln's Inn, Gray's Inn, Inner Temple and Middle Temple. It's sort of like a membership to a club in a sense. It doesn't really mean anything. You have to be a member of one. I don't think you can apply and be rejected from one. And all they really provide, or the principal thing they provide, is you can apply for scholarships through the Inns to fund not only the bar training course year, but also the GDL, the law conversion course year as well. And I think you retain membership or you're in forever, and you can go to talks there and events there and things as well. So that was a
Brilliant. Thank you, Alice. So I'll just explain the solicitor's route. So as Alice said, you can, for whether it's being a barrister or being a solicitor, you can do whatever degree you want to start with, whether that's law or biochemistry or whatever. And then it used to be, or it still is, depending on how far through the process you are, that you would do the same law conversion course that Alice talks about, the graduate diploma in law. And if you've already done that, you would then do another year. Instead of doing the BBC, you would do the LPC, and then you go and do which is another year study, and then you go and do a 2-year training contract at a law firm where you would do, 3 or 4 different seats, different types of law. One of which, if you wanted to do IP, you would try and get on an IP seat, and then you would qualify. The system's changing though, so if you haven't yet done the GDL, the law conversion, or if you've done a law degree, you're going to be able to in future to not do the GDL and not have to go through that process, and instead you're going to do what's called the SQE. So SQE, there's 2 parts to it, SQE 1 and 2, and basically it's like a law conversion and the second bit, the LPC, but it's wrapped up together. You do that process, and then you have 2 years of qualifying work experience. And that can be a training contract, like it is at the moment, but it doesn't have to be. So you could paralegal a firm, and that would be qualifying work experience. And you can do that alongside your SQE if you want to work part-time, for instance, and do the SQE at the same time. So it's in flux, and it's one of those things that that actually the law firms in around the country are kind of in this period where they're switching over, and it's kind of in a transition period at the moment. So it's not dissimilar, but it is in transition at the moment. Okay, so I think. Go on, Mike.
No, I'm sorry. Could I just thought it might be worth adding on the Inns of Court, just for those who aren't familiar. It may be worth just mentioning that although, as Alice has described, the principal route, the principal education that you have to go through to qualify for a barrister was historically provided by the Inns of Court, and that's no longer the case. But they do provide a range of education and training, some of which is mandatory for you to do while you're doing the bar course. The other thing that they provide, though, is a range of scholarships and bursaries, which are called different things in different courts. But they are available to help fund you through your training period. And so for any of you who are thinking about qualifying in this area, it's quite an important thing to be aware of, and it is worth looking at the point where you are thinking about doing the GDL course or later the bar course, looking into the scholarships that are available and are provided by the various Inns of Court. So that's just something to be aware of as part of your kind of thinking on your training routes.
Yeah, and equally, if you on the solicitor side, law firms will sponsor you to do the academic side beforehand and pay for that, and normally give you some money to live on. So again, that's something to think about earlier rather than later. So we've got quite a few different routes that have to qualifying as lawyers, and maybe if we just kind of step through. So James, I don't know whether you want to talk about how you ended up here, what your route was.
Yeah, so mine is probably a little different to everyone else's. I didn't qualify in the UK, so I qualified in Australia and then came over and joined PG last September. So in Australia, we don't have any conversion courses. So I did a science background, I did a science degree, and then I did a full law degree as well. And then after that, I did clerkships, or what's probably similar to VAC scheme. So did that, and then joined an IP firm there.
And what was your thinking from moving from science degree towards law?
Yeah, so it wasn't the original plan. When I did science, I thought I was going to go into sort of the research side of things. But when I got to the end of it, I sort of realized that I like working more collaboratively and in teams, and I like the element of law. So I sort of that attracted me, and then I gave law a go, and then did an elective IP law. So it sort of made sense to combine both of my interests together.
Jess, what was your route?
Sure, I did civil engineering at university, and from the age of about 16 was pretty stuck on being a civil engineer. And then I had work experience, kind of civil engineering summer internships, basically in between each of my summers when I was at uni. And as much as I really liked the academic elements of my degree, I really couldn't really get behind the kind of career path of a civil engineer, and I wanted to kind of be more client facing, more commercial. And my friend that actually was doing biochemistry at uni at the time said, "Oh, I've actually just got a training contract at Bristow's, you should look at law." And I said, "Oh, okay." So then I kind of did loads of research, went to a lot of law events, which can be pretty full on when you're kind of a non-law student at university going to law events, because there's a lot of law is often a very big subject, and it's filled with kind of very impressive first years and second year law students that really know their stuff. And you will be coming in, I was a fourth year engineering student just trying to work out what it was. And then I got a VAC scheme at a law firm in the city, and luckily from there I got a training contract. So then they funded, like Tom said, they funded for me to do the GDL and the LPC, and then I trained for them for 2 years. And I guess during that 2-year training contract, I got a seat in IP. I think basically it was quite high up on my list of wants, but they see anybody with a STEM background and they think, great, you're going to go into the IP team. And I just absolutely loved it. It was in my second seat, so I still had a year to go after that. But kind of the next 2 seats that I didn't really kind of tug on my heartstrings like IP had, as cringy as that sounds. So then from then on, I just knew I wanted to do IP. And then I found Powell Gilbert, so that's how I've ended up here. I moved here on qualification almost 3 years ago now.
Great, Jess. Alice, do you want to tell us about your background?
Yeah, so I did a biochemistry degree, which was a 4-year course because I had no idea what I wanted to do for my first 3 years. So I'm very grateful it was 4 years. And then sort of fell into the law. I was actually called to be a juror in one of my summer holidays at the Old Bailey, which is honestly how I ended up thinking I wanted to be a barrister. So I was sat in a criminal trial for 2 weeks and thought this is pretty cool. And then did a bit more reading about it, and again sort of people that I knew said, "Oh, you've got a science degree and you're interested in being a barrister, what about IP?" And read about it a bit. I did a few sort of workshops and events like this at law firms, and I started to do some mini pupilages, which are sort of 1 to 2, sometimes up to 5-day shadowing experiences you can do in sets of barristers' chambers. So I did a few of those, and that was it. Applied for the GDL, and yeah, applied to 3 New Square. Well, applied to all the IP chambers during my GDL year, and then got the offer, and then you basically you apply about 18 months in advance for pupillage. So before you commit to starting the bar course, and then started there in September 2018 and qualified, I suppose, in September 2019.
And Pete, well, I think everyone here actually you've got a science background as well.
Yeah.
Did you always know you wanted to go into IP, or did you dabble with other areas?
No, I didn't know for certain. So I think I have a similar background to some other people. Probably when I was 15, 16, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. Went and did some 2 weeks work experience in a hospital. Realised I really didn't want to be a doctor. And then I did a physiology degree, got to the 3rd year of that and thought I still have no idea what I want to do. And at that time, there were lots of kind of careers fairs, and everybody in their 3rd year was all getting het up about what they were going to do. And so we went to all these career fairs. And I didn't want to be an investment banker, and I looked at sort of graduate recruitment schemes in various big companies, and then spoke to various law firms there and thought, oh, that sounds all right. So I applied for some vacation schemes and did 3 of those after my my final year at uni, and then really enjoyed those. And so then got the training contract offer and organised the GDL and so forth. But yeah, I didn't really know a lot about IP until those vacation schemes, and I was lucky that in one of them I spent a week in an IP department and just really enjoyed it. And they were doing a pharmaceutical patent litigation case, and it was just a great way of actually feeling like I could understand something that was going on, because there's not a lot you understand when you're doing a vacation scheme and you've never been in a big office, let alone a law office. So then I was fortunate that the firm that I ended up going to had a good IP department, and like Jess, I did 6 months in that department and really enjoyed it. But yeah, it was sort of fell into it really, rather than it being sort of planned.
Mike, did you always know you wanted to be an IP barrister, or did you think about also being a solicitor or other things?
No, I didn't, and I think like others around the table, I had a somewhat kind of diverse route, and I came to it perhaps a bit later than some others. So, like Alice, I did a biochemistry degree as an undergraduate, and then my immediate first steps was into policy, and specifically higher education policy, and I worked there for a number of years before then coming back and doing a DPhil in sort of genetics. And it was actually during the course of that that I hit upon, I suppose, the idea of going into IP law. And it was specifically the IP bar, and it was partly fortuitous in that a friend of a friend who was a barrister, a completely different area, but we were sort of just having drinks and kind of just floated this idea that, given my background, was this something I might be interested in. So from a sort of zero starting point, I suppose, I started looking into it, and the more I looked into it, the more I liked about the idea, and that was really my starting off point. So certainly wasn't a vocation, but one that I arrived at.
I think that's maybe a difference with the barrister and solicitor route, actually, because if you go down the solicitor route and you do a training contract, you obviously have 4 seats in different departments. So you're not at that early stage IP committed. And in fact, I know friends who have set out saying, I want to be an IP lawyer, and doing a training contract and ending up in funds or banking or something else. Whereas for us, I mean, the main chambers that do IP are specialist IP chambers. So by the, once you've applied and once you're there, you're committed to it. And thankfully, I mean, I really like it. Sounds like Mike likes it too. So it's lucky, but you don't get a chance to try other stuff once you're there and once you've committed.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we should talk a bit about if you have got an interest in IP and you're thinking of applying to a law firm, what kind of law firms would be the ones to aim for? Because not every firm does IP. And so, if you're doing a training contract and you're going to do 4 seats, you want to try and think about trying to target those which have a good reputation. I don't know whether Pete or Jess, you want to talk about the kind of firms that you were interested in, whether you saw that as you selected them on that basis.
Sure. I think because I had been recommended kind of Bristow's as just by virtue of being my friend getting a training contract there, I definitely did look at Bristow's. But actually at the time, I didn't know anything about IP, and I wasn't actually sure I wanted to do IP. So although it interested me, Bristow's is a very IP focused firm, and I at the time thought maybe I want to go to a more full service firm, a fuller service firm, if I can say, just so that I can dabble in lots of different things and see how I go. But I definitely did think about IP and make sure that the firms that I was applying to did have a strong IP department. And then I'm not sure whether anybody here kind of is on that path, but when you are on a training contract, even though you might be in a 6-month kind of period in a certain team, you can still kind of reach out to different teams and just explore and talk to partners and even talk to kind of your friends in your cohort that might be in those seats to just get an idea of what it's like. And I just so happened to know somebody in the intake above me that had been in the IP team, and she was having an amazing time. And I got super interested, and I was again just lucky because I knew that a trial was coming in, and I managed to talk to people and become very good friends with with kind of HR at the time, which is top tip if you are looking at it, because they do have a lot of power actually when they're kind of placing trainees in certain positions. And just fortuitously got in at the right time. But yeah, it's definitely something to have on your radar, and if you can kind of talk to that in applications and say I have an interest here, and I can see that your team's quite strong in this area, it definitely makes you stand out if you've done your research.
Yeah, and I just completely echo that. I think have a look at some of the big directories like Legal 500, Chambers, UVA Patent, if you're interested in patents, and have a look at their rankings on IP, just to really check that firms that you're interested in definitely do IP, because lots of firms don't. And then obviously go on the websites of those firms and have a look at what they say about their IP department, and you'll get a flavour as to whether it's a bit more focused on litigation, a bit more non-contentious, whether it's quite heavy on patents or much broader in terms of the IP rights. So do that research, and then I think, as Jess said, if you're fortunate and you get your training contract, once you're in the firm, definitely try and befriend HR, because they've got a lot of sway. But also, I mean, certainly when I was a trainee, there were lots of sort of firm events that you would get invited to, and so it would be good to try. My recommendation would certainly be to go and find out who the main IP people are, and sort of try and make a bit of a beeline for them at some of those events, so that you get to meet them and you talk to them and you tell them that you're really interested in IP as well. And then you're sort of coming at it from both sides, because you do, certainly in the bigger firms, you have to be quite determined and make it known that you want to do IP, and then you sort of keep pushing. You might not get it in your first, second, or even third seat, but if you keep at it, then hopefully you'll get a chance to sit there and see what it's like.
Great. So as we said, I think everyone here has some kind of a STEM background, but equally there are lots of people, some people at Powell Gilbert that have law backgrounds or other degrees, and I guess that's the same. Is that the same at your chambers, Mike?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, yes, there are some. Yeah. The majority probably would stand.
Yeah, and how have you found your science background? Have you found it of assistance in your career as an IP lawyer?
Personally, I have, but I think it's important not to overstate it. So I think for me, it was it was firstly of assistance in directing me to this area, but I think also at the outset, although Chambers, there are people who don't have a STEM background, it is important to be able to show that you've got both an interest in and an acumen for technical areas, if not through direct academic qualifications, then through some other experience and interest that you can demonstrate. And so, but having the academics on that was helpful at the outset. And I think probably in your early career, well, perhaps the others around the table can speak to this more, but from the perspective of solicitors firms, it's certainly not unhelpful, I would suggest, to have that background on your CV. But that's kind of at the outset, and I think much more important as you progress in your careers is that people get to know you and know how you work, and whether that you're someone that they like working with. And certainly I would say you are dealing with a very broad area of work, and that encompasses many different technical areas, and of course not just patents, in different areas of intellectual property as well. So it's certainly not the case that you are likely to be directly applying the experience that you have accrued at undergraduate or even postgraduate level. You may, but it's more about just having that sort of technical acumen and being able to sort of demonstrate that, I think.
James, is that your experience? Have you put your back degree into practice much?
Yeah, here and there, but I would echo that completely as well. I think having a technical background helps, and then I guess as your career progresses, I think, you know, sometimes you will have matters where it can be of assistance, but given the breadth of matters that IP covers, you know, only certain times I would say probably your technical background's really going to hit on those areas. So I think, yeah, I would just agree that it's really your ability to uptake that sort of technical information and have an interest and understanding of it.
I mean, Pete, at Powell Gilbert, we have people who have, you know, life science backgrounds, physics background, computing backgrounds. Do you want to say something about, you know, whether they tend to be fit into those kind of cases, or whether they tend to be work even broader than that?
I think it depends a lot on the individuals and what they want. But, you know, certainly if a matter comes in that's a really sort of heavy technical telecoms case, for example, having somebody who's got the physics or the maths experience and can pick up those patterns and really, you know, understand them on a first read is always beneficial. But you know, often, you know, particularly people with sort of physics and maths backgrounds, in my experience, they sometimes get a bit fed up with always being asked to do those sorts of cases, and they want more breadth. And so, yeah, it's very much based on the individual. I think it's certainly useful initially when you start a case, if you've got some familiarity with the background. It can certainly help in bringing in work, because obviously I don't think I'd really realised this or really thought about this before I joined the profession, but I mean, law is a service industry. You know, we are working for clients the whole time, so we have to go out, we have to get the clients and bring the work in. And I think being able to say to a client who's got a new case, well, we've got people on our team that have got these backgrounds, and you know, that's really helpful. But yeah, at the end of the day, a lot of people want more breadth than, you know, just one particular area. And as both Mike and James have said, I think it's, you know, really what matters is just having an interest in the technical subject matter, and I think not being afraid of it, and being sort of open and willing to ask probably what seem very stupid questions to often very clever and incredibly intelligent, very technically able sort of experts and things. We often have to just ask them really stupid questions to make sure that we understand the basics, and just not being afraid of it, I think, is probably the key, and being interested in it. If you're not interested in how these things work, you're going to get quite bored on a patent case quite quickly.
So we've talked about a barrister and solicitor route, and we'll maybe come on to talk about what the difference is in a minute. But one thing that maybe gets less coverage maybe at university is another profession, I suppose, which is patent attorney route or trademark attorney. And so that's another profession, again, which all of these professions have kind of quite a lot of overlap, quite frankly. But it's a different route to qualification. It's probably worth just mentioning that. But I don't know whether you want to say something briefly about what the role of a patent attorney is.
I thought you were going to ask me about the route to qualification. Attorney. So patent attorneys, you know, primarily are there. Their sort of bread and butter is actually drafting patents. So they'll meet with people that come up with inventions, they'll talk about it, and they'll get it down in writing in a patent document. And there's an incredible skill to doing that, because you know, once the patent's been drafted, it has to go through an application process, and it gets really scrutinized by patent examiners. Hopefully it gets granted, and then if you're really unlucky, people like us then start scrutinizing it in litigation later, and we sort of, you know, really look at every word and, well, what's meant by this? How would this be understood? So there's a real skill to drafting patents and being able to cover not only the absolute core invention that the person has come up with, but also enough around that to provide protection, and ensure that somebody doesn't effectively take most of your invention and do a little tweak and then be able to get away with it. So yeah, so patent patent attorneys, their main role is in getting those inventions down on paper and getting them through the patent office to get granted patents that are actually commercially viable and valuable.
Yeah, and we often work quite closely with patent attorneys in various ways, shapes, and forms. And then, Jess, do you want to talk a bit about how our role differs from a patent attorney as an IP solicitor?
Sure. Well, Pete touched on it very briefly in that we often come in. So a client, say, for example, might come in and say, we think that this company is effectively copying our inventions, infringing our patents. And so what we'll do is we'll look at their patent portfolio, which has been kind of drafted by the patent attorneys and brought through, and kind of stress test them, scrutinise them, and think about which ones we could potentially enforce through the courts here in the UK or potentially in Europe or kind of globally for a wider litigation strategy, depending on what the client wants and where these products are. And then kind of touching on the defensive side, we might have a client that says, we've been watching this other company's patent portfolio. We think we potentially, I don't know, do we have freedom to operate? What does this look like for us? Does our product potentially infringe any of these rights? So we might look at that from kind of just a kind of pre-litigation perspective. And then when it comes to litigation, potentially a client's been sued, then that's when the real fun begins, when we do scrutinise the patent, because at that point, when you're kind of on the defensive side of these things, you're really scrutinising absolutely every single word and seeing, kind of stress testing every sentence, trying to look and find different prior art, or kind of inventions, sorry, if you don't know, prior art kind of is stuff that was around at the time that the invention was originally created, and to see whether you can argue that kind of the invention wasn't new, it was already basically kind of very much known to the public, or whether it wasn't actually invented because it would have been obvious. There's kind of a whole heap of arguments that you have at your disposal. And often we'll be working with patent attorneys, for example, on the defensive side, they'll be often challenging the patents in the patent office, or have challenged those patents in the patent office before it comes to litigation. So we'll be working with them saying, kind of, what arguments did you think of before? Did you find anything? Could you do kind of a different search? And we'll be working with them there. And then even on the offensive side, we can often work with patent attorneys because we're trying to, our client potentially can see a product that's kind of similar to what they've got on their patents, but they don't have a patent that might quite cover it, and they want to see whether they have some very clever drafting that they can potentially do to try and capture and potentially stop this other product being on the market. So again, it's very overlapping, I'd say.
And then Alice, you want to talk about the interaction between how the barrister fits into that kind of picture?
Yes, so most of the work, that the vast majority of the work that certainly I do, and I think most barristers do, is once proceedings have started, or just shortly before proceedings start for patent infringement or an invalidity action in the UK. So at that stage, typically solicitors, though actually patent attorneys can also instruct barristers directly. I don't know if you need a special something for that, but I have been instructed by a patent attorney before, so you must be able to do it. And it's at that stage we usually get involved and drafting the initial legal documents, the statements of case setting out the challenge to the patent, or defending an allegation that's been made against users. Generally at that stage we become much more closely involved. And then I'd say, compared to my understanding of other areas of law, I think the solicitor-barrister relationship in IP is very, very collaborative. It's a real team effort. There isn't a dividing line that a barrister only touches certain documents and solicitors never do. I think it's wonderfully collaborative in a way that a lot of areas aren't. So it's a real team effort, and which I think is great. Unlike criminal law, for example, where you often actually don't meet the solicitors instructing you, and the case is sort of handed to you and you can do whatever you like with it. It's very, very different.
And James, one of the things I think is most interesting about the job is that obviously we're qualified in a particular jurisdiction, and patents, for example, are national rights. But quite often, there'll be patents all over the world and there'll be infringements all over the world. And so a client has a problem you know, not just in the UK or not just in Europe, but in America or Asia or whatever. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the roles that certainly solicitors do in terms of kind of helping the client to manage that?
Yeah, definitely. So particularly, this is something that was quite an interest to me coming from Australia to the UK and obviously Europe. So in Australia, it's a bit more of a satellite jurisdiction, so it would work the opposite way. But specifically my experience at PG and working in Europe, will often have a client and they'll have a patent portfolio all around Europe, and we will manage their entire portfolio. So we'll work with, as Tom said, their national rights. So we'll work with different jurisdictions around Europe, and we obviously predominantly do litigation. So we'll work with them on their litigation strategies and make sure that everything's in line across all the jurisdictions and it's all lining up. So we work really closely with a lot of foreign jurisdiction teams in running a lot of different matters for clients.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe different than the barrister route, where they tend to very much focus on the UK litigation. We tend to get involved in lots of litigation strategy across Europe and elsewhere in the world, and also help those teams to kind of, you know, put forward the best case, normally in parallel to a UK case, because we will have thought about the arguments in some detail already. Maybe if we move on to just kind of what day to day a typical day looks like. Mike, I don't know whether you want to go first and just give us a kind of highlight of what a normal day might look like for you.
It's a good question, but it's quite a difficult one to answer actually, because it's going to sound like a bit of a cliche, but it's quite hard to define a typical day because it can be so varied. I think one thing it's probably important to say is that certainly in our area, although you will be in court fairly regularly, it's certainly not a day-to-day thing, and it's I would class it as infrequent that you would actually be in court, whether that would be in trial or for another kind of hearing. So a more typical day would probably be a mix of conferences and meetings, typically these days online, and paperwork, and the sorts of things you'll be dealing with both in that paperwork and the kind of meetings can vary from providing advice to your legal team or the client on particular points of strategy in a case, or more, which can be kind of quite informal through sort of exchanges on particular points when you're in the cut and thrust approaching the trial, or you can be asked to set out in a more formal way a broader position on the merits of a particular action. You might be in the course of drafting advocacy documents, for example, when you're approaching trials, skeleton arguments, things like that. Or as IP barristers, we often also become quite involved in the process of preparing evidence for trial, and that can involve being involved in meetings with the experts, and so discussing the case with them with a view to ultimately preparing the expert reports, or indeed reviewing and helping in the process of preparing those reports as well. And all of those things, and of course you'll be on a mix of different, you'll be instructed on many different cases at one time, so you can be doing all of those things on different cases and in different areas in a typical day. And that's why I think it's very hard to describe a typical day, because it can be so varied in that way.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And Pete, do you want to say how what we do maybe is the same or differs from that?
It's similar in lots of ways. I think maybe the biggest difference probably is that I think the solicitors will spend a lot more of their time preparing the case to get to trial. So we'll spend quite a lot of time speaking to clients directly, a lot of time speaking to lots of different expert witnesses, trying to select the best one for a particular case, and that's, you know, often that selection process we made at that point work more closely with the barristers, and kind of introduce them to a few and sort of ask their thoughts on strengths and weaknesses of the different potential experts. And then we'll spend a lot of time working with that expert to prepare an expert report. There's a lot more sort of documentary stuff as well that the solicitors have to do. So there's often a process called disclosure, which is effectively going out and searching for documents that the client has that are relevant to the issues in the case. We're lucky in IP litigation that we don't have to do as much of this as big commercial litigation, but that can involve looking through quite a lot of documents and looking and trying to work out whether they've got anything in them that's relevant, and if so, what, whether they've got stuff in them that's confidential and how that's going to be dealt with. What else do we? Whereas I think, and again, it depends a little bit on seniority. So as you become more senior in the role, you probably spend more time on going out and going to conferences and meetings and trying to bring in clients, because as I said, particularly, well, certainly for solicitors, at the end of the day, it is a service industry, and we have to persuade clients to come to us and work with us on their cases. So that's quite a big part of the job as well.
One question here we've got: what is, Alice, what do you think your the most rewarding and most challenging aspects of your job are?
One of the most challenging things, Mike almost touched on it, is you will be working often on lots of different cases all at one time, and it takes a while to be able to shift your brain into a different case. So you might be really deep into a document on a particular case about I don't know, a sort of pain relief drug, and then your phone will ring and it'll be someone asking you about a case about a beer brand, and you just have to be able to context shift in that moment, and when you were deep in something. And I found that challenging at the beginning, and you get better at it. Most rewarding is a hard one. I mean, I think so much work goes into the sorts of cases that end up in front of a judge at trial. And I think just getting a case prepared and submitting that skeleton argument just before trial on the first day, and turning up knowing it's all ready and the judge is there waiting to hear you, it's quite a rewarding feeling. No matter how the trial actually goes, just sort of turning up on the first day, I always find quite sort of satisfying, rewarding feeling that we've got there, we've prepared, and we're ready to give it our best shot.
One of the things you mentioned, Alice, is having different matters, and that maybe is different in IP law than other areas of law. So I don't know whether, Jess, you want to say how many matters you typically have on the go at one time, and what kind of different portion of your time they might take?
Yeah, I think it completely varies in terms of kind of the matters that you work on. So, for example, in my experience at PD, I've had kind of one major client and therefore kind of case and strategy piece that I've been working on ever since I joined the firm. So that's kind of always been my kind of bread and butter on my weekly basis. And then depending on my capacity, I do dabble quite a lot in some other areas. But then for one client, for example, we're doing kind of quite a big anti-counterfeiting kind of strategy for one of our clients. And as a result, we are kind of hopefully we'll have kind of more cases, but we were doing kind of a test round where we had kind of 3 cases ongoing in the court at one time, which was quite stressful because at the time all of the defendants were litigants in person, which unfortunately means that for the solicitors on the claimant side, you get quite a lot of calls from panicked people that don't really understand what the process is, and as much as you can advise them to get to go to always citizens advice and get some representation, that sometimes doesn't happen. So it really does vary. So for example, kind of today I have worked on four different matters, and again you do have to context shift, but it's definitely not the case where kind of you get a call and you need an answer straight away. But then that can change. I mean, in the run up to trial, for example, you might have counsel calling you, asking you kind of, oh, where was that kind of, was there a letter somewhere that we sent that said this? And kind of those kind of last minute kind of preparations for trial do mean that you have kind of a similar experience to what Alice said.
James, do you think that there's, in doing IP, you have more matters or less matters than other departments? I mean, I don't know what other departments you trained in when you were in Australia.
Yeah, so I did a variety of different departments when I was sort of figuring out what I wanted to do in the legal side of things. But I'd say from my experience, it's probably you do work on more matters, probably working in IP than other departments. I just probably because of the size of the matters and I guess the variety, whereas probably from more of a commercial side of things, you M&A and that sort of thing, you might just be on one big matter and it's all sort of go during that matter, and then you'll down cycle to a new matter, whereas ours is sort of like juggling different plates kind of thing, that it's very rare that you'd go from one trial and then straight into another trial. It's sort of a build up for matters, so during that time you can sort of juggle a variety of different matters.
We've got a question here about how collaborative the different roles are, and Mike, I don't know whether you want to talk about what life's like in a barrister, because obviously you're self-employed. You know, you don't necessarily have a team around you. Is that fair?
Well, I'm not sure. It is actually in some ways, and I think Alice really put her finger on it earlier. And in fact, it's one of the things I like most about our area. I think it may differ in other areas of law, as Alice suggested, that actually we do work really quite collaboratively with our solicitor teams instructing us. Also with other counsel frequently. That's not always the case, as Tom says. Sometimes you are instructed on matters and you are running them as sole counsel, and then obviously you know, in terms of your working chambers, you are on your own, but even then you're working very closely with those instructing you. But also we very often, especially on patent cases, will be working within a small team of barristers as well. So often as a junior, you will have a senior KC that you're working with, and sometimes there'll be more than one junior barrister on the team as well. And you will be working very closely with them, especially when it comes to the run up to trial, when you really do kind of enter the bunker, if you like, with your lead counsel, and you'll be sitting, you know, often, you know, for long hours in their room, working through cross-examination and preparing and thinking about how you're going to present the case. And that is very much something that I really enjoy about our work. I think it's quite different from this sort of idea of getting a bundle of instructions, and I think the old days that it used to be sort of tied up with ribbon and so on, and there it is, and you know, go on and you present the case in court as it may be the next day. Our work is quite different from that. And
Pete, what do you think of how collaborative law firms tend to be in comparison? Well, not comparison, but you know, are they different departments more or less collaborative? What was IP like?
I think certainly IP litigation, you know, it tends to be teamwork. You know, it's not something that you're going to do on your own. So on certainly the sort of patent cases we work on, you know, we can have a reasonably sized team within the firm, and then obviously the counsel team as well. So I think, yeah, everything we do is very collaborative. How it compares to other departments, I think it's difficult to say really, but I think certainly yeah, the sort of work we have to do involves a lot of thinking. You know, we're surrounded, you know, what I love most about the job is that we're surrounded by lots of really intelligent, incredibly hardworking and quite eclectic group of people. And the best bit is just getting those people together and thrashing around ideas, talking about strategies, getting everybody's kind of input and trying to work out what the best way forward is. It's really, yeah, I can't think of anything that we do where we're just sort of sat on our own doing it, apart from when you actually just have to read in and, you know, read the documents, which is quite a big part of the job as well. But then, you know, other people are also reading them, and you can go and talk to them and ask them about, well, you know, what do you think that bit means, or what do you think about this? So yeah, you're never really on your own, which is good.
One of the things you mentioned was being hardworking. James, I really want to say, we had a question about what the working hours are typically like. Are you able to spill the beans on that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I guess from my experience, it can vary at firms, what firms you're at, but also particularly in IP, I think what life cycle the matter's at. So if it's sort of in, you know, there is no litigation yet, then it's pretty regular hours, but then I guess it'll be no surprise that as things are heating up and it's getting towards trial, the hours sort of expand beyond 9 to 5. But yeah, I think it could really vary. But in my experience, as you get closer to trial and in trial, that the hours expand beyond the 9 to 5. But then not to sell it, but on the other side, when things are quieter, it is definitely sort of a 9 to 5 role. So balances.
Jess, you've done lots of different experience in different departments of law firms. How does IP compare to other areas of law?
I'm not lying when I say it's actually better. I think again, it depends. When you're a trainee, often you're at the whim of what your kind of supervisor is like, unfortunately, and also kind of how busy that department is at the time. So I was in a transactional role where the team was quite small, and it was great because actually as a trainee I got lots of responsibility, and the hours were kind of more in my control because my supervisor was quite relaxed. And then my IP seat was actually I had a similar experience to what James said. I had quite a relaxed kind of beginning. When I joined the team, we were just at exchange of the first round of expert reports, and then things did ramp up as we got towards trial. But it was so exciting that it kind of, all kind of hell's above. And then, as Alistair said, it's actually really rewarding when you kind of get to trial, especially as kind of a trainee at the time, having worked really hard, and then kind of just being at trial and experiencing it and not having to worry about being in charge of anything was quite exciting. And then I was the corporate seat that I was in. I actually went to on secondment, so client secondment was a lot sweeter deal than I think I could have been given had I stayed at the firm. So yeah, I think in any career you've got to kind of protect yourself, I think, a little bit when if you kind of are too eager, I think sometimes you can realize that you're burning yourself out without actually needing to, and that also just comes with experience and realizing kind of what does need to necessarily be done now, what doesn't, maybe speaking with people when they haven't given you clear deadlines, just so you can actually understand the scope of what you have to do. But that, again, that comes with experience.
Yeah. And how does the bar compare, Alice?
I think it's similar. I think definitely in the ramp up to trial, you want to be expecting to dedicate most of your life to it, for sure. And I think more generally, as we touched on, if you're working on a variety of different cases at any one time, often from being instructed by different firms of solicitors who obviously aren't talking to each other, and just all cases in different stages of the life cycle, as James said, and sometimes 3 cases will sort of have their peak at the same time, sometimes 5 cases will have a trough at the same time, and you'll just go through stages of sort of uncontrollable busyness, and then other times where it's much quieter. And I think you just learn to slowly, I'm definitely still learning, but slowly, to when it is a bit quieter, really take that time and recharge, and then be prepared to work hard at those particularly busy times.
And one of the things that is obviously different about being a barrister, or not obviously, but it tends to be different, is barristers tend to be self-employed, and solicitors are obviously tend to be employed in a law firm. Mike, I don't know whether you want to say, whether that brings challenges that people should be considering being self-employed.
I think it does bring challenges, and particularly actually on this issue of your time and how you monitor that, because it really is about disciplining yourself and controlling your own sort of time and making sure that you obviously are having to work very, very hard at times, and as Hannah said, there can be a challenge actually in when you do have those troughs and those quiet periods, to really sort of understand that that's to take advantage of that and to recharge, as Alice put it, because I think when there's no one sort of who's monitoring your hours, and no one is checking up on how long you're in chambers, whatever, a day for a particular day, you tend, I think, to push yourself, and in some ways more than perhaps you would if you had sort of standard and expected hours. So just kind of learning that sort of self-discipline, I think, can be a challenge, but it's one that comes with experience, really.
Yeah. And James, I mean, I guess thinking about the other side of it is, the stability. Mike, I don't really want to say something about financially, I know it's a bit more up and down as to when you get paid. It's not a monthly paycheck kind of thing.
Yeah, that's also true. Sorry, and that's probably more the thrust of your question. I mean, I think there is a bit of an up and down, and of course, in terms of the busyness, with that comes actually what money's coming in. But I think again, when you establish yourself a little bit, you've usually got kind of when you're in the sort of leaner spell from work, you may have had a very busy period beforehand. So it all kind of tends to even out, and I think we're probably quite lucky in IP in that there is quite a lot of work around, and most of the time you are pretty busy, and you're not really worried about the financials of it. I think you've just got to, when you have those perhaps a week or so when it's, I haven't really got a lot going on at the moment, just to sort of, it's fine. I was absolutely worked to the bone last month, and that will have its financial rewards, and I don't need to worry about the fact that I'm in a slightly more relaxed period at the moment. But again, it's just experience, I think.
Okay. So I guess law typically isn't seen historically as a particularly diverse profession. That's kind of been the general consensus. Pete, I don't know whether you want to talk about your views on how the legal profession is in terms of its diversity.
Yeah, I certainly think it's improved a lot since I started, which was back in 2004. I think generally when I look around now, there's a much better gender balance than there was back then, but there's still a lot of work to do. There are still more men than women in the profession, and that needs some work. And I think a lot of work needs to be done on bringing people from more diverse backgrounds and giving them the opportunities to get into the profession. Certainly when we see it and we see the CVs coming in for roles, it is still quite weighted towards sort of white middle class applicants, and so I think a lot of work needs to be done at the university levels and before to just try and get a more encouraging pool and more diverse pool through. There's I spend a lot of time going to conferences, and diversity is a big issue at conferences, and it's very interesting hearing what different companies are doing to try and improve their diversity. So not just lawyers, but our clients. And there's certainly a lot of research that shows that diverse teams are much more productive and much more successful. So yeah, I think it's improving, but I think there's still an awful lot to do.
Okay. And Pete, obviously, you are have adopted with your partner some boys. I don't really talk about diversity in that sense with helping the LBGT.
Yeah, sure. So so my husband and I have adopted 2 children. I'm just trying to think back to again when I went into the profession in 2004. I was openly gay in my personal life, and I remember going into a big law firm and just thinking, how is this going to work? What's it going to be like? And just quite apprehensive really at that point. Personally, I've never had any issues, any real issues, which is great. I think I'm probably quite fortunate in that sense, but I think again, as times are moving on, firms are getting much better at that. But it can be just little things like, clients will, quite early on in a relationship, a client might say to me, "Oh, what does your wife do?" And I have to sort of, you have to decide, well, am I going to make a point? Am I going to say something, or am I just going to go along with it? So there are little things like that you still have to think about, where there's just a bit more of an assumption that's made. And I always, well, not always, but the vast majority of time, I would just sort of say, "Oh, actually, my husband's an IT consultant," and then move on. And I think, well, if the client's got a problem with it, then I don't want that client, because that's going to have an impact on my team at the firm, and there'll be other people that will feel uncomfortable. So generally speaking, my experience has been really positive on the LGBT side. on the adoption side, so yeah, my husband and I adopted 2 children back in 2014. And the adoption process is quite involved in getting to the stage of being able to adopt. So that required a lot of support from colleagues. It's a lot of time involved in research and spending a lot of time with social workers and having quite emotional conversations. And that, it's so difficult. It's a big chunk of your time and you're trying to hold down a day job. So that was quite a challenge. But it really is just about the support of people around you. And then when we adopted them, adoption leave is available in a very similar way to maternity leave. Although when I did it in 2014, it was quite unusual for a man to say, well, I want to take 6 months off to look after children. Luckily, that's becoming much more commonplace now with shared parental leave. So a number of our male associates are now sharing sharing the maternity leave, but sharing that period of time. So I think it's becoming much more common, and we're seeing it a lot more, and it doesn't raise eyebrows in the same way as it maybe did back then. Yeah, so again, I think really it's, I personally, I found it a very supportive community, both within Powell Gilbert and also the London IP network is really small and really collegiate. So there's a lot of events, you know a lot of people at other firms, and I've always felt on both fronts it's a very supportive kind of community to be in.
Okay, I think we have more than used up our time. So I don't know whether anyone in the room or online, if that's possible, have any questions that they particularly want answered that we haven't touched on. But if not, we will be around afterwards if you want to ask any questions.
We do have one question from someone who's joined remotely. It's fairly specific. Can a patent barrister hold a legitimate business interest while also being a barrister? So can you be a CEO of a STEM startup whilst also being at the bar? I mean, maybe from a admin point of view, that might be quite a lot. I don't know what.
Can the people online hear the question? Do we need to repeat it?
See, people online.
Okay.
Sorry, Mike.
Quite a specific question.
I'm afraid I'm not aware of any reason why not, but I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know if I'm looking across at Alice, and I'm not sure that Alice is giving a different answer. So I'm sorry, I'm not able to give you a definitive answer, other than I'm not aware of a specific reason why not.
Anyone else at all? No? Okay, well, thanks to everyone for coming, and hopefully that was a useful insight. If you've got any questions, then just grab any of us after the talk. Okay.
Thank you to our panel. That's been incredibly informative, and thank you all for coming. I think, as you're all aware, we are offering a week of work experience in August. There are 2 places available, and if you attended last week, you've hopefully already got the application form, but if not, we'll be sending the application form to you all, and we look forward to you applying. The recording will be available online, so if anyone wants to go back and listen to the answers again, you can. Thank you to all the remote participants. We will leave you now, and people who are here in the office, we can head through to one of the other meeting rooms, and we can have some drinks, and you'll have the opportunity to ask some more questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Anna.